Mark Shelton. Everybody calls me the Shark. I'm the lead guitar player and one of the singers for the band Manila Road. I'm the only founder of the band that's still left. Actually started the band in 1977 in Wichita, Kansas, and I went to John Marshall Junior High School. It wasn't a middle school back then, it was junior high back in those days, and went on to North High School for my high school years. Attended WSU later. Got lucky after doing some albums on our own and producing our own stuff. We got lucky and scored some contracts in Europe back in all around 1983, and we have had a pretty prolific career ever since, and are actually graced with being pretty popular in most of Europe, including Scandinavia and even the Mediterranean. Definitely more popular in Europe than we are in the States, but a lot of that popularity came from the fact that we actually don't do music that's based on just rock and roll and sex and drugs and stuff like that. Most of our lyric content is based off of history, mythology, or literature, and when we come to literature, Edgar Allan Poe is definitely one of the huge influences in as far as literary content for some of our music. Europe's been a extravagant experience for me and everybody that's gone there with me. We've been touring Europe ever since I'd say 2000, and been fortunate enough to be popular enough in a lot of places over there that we've actually been headlining our own shows and some major festivals over there for the last 6 or 7 years. And I find Europe just fascinating. There's so much antiquity all over the place, especially in places like Italy. You know, you go anywhere in Italy and you see bits and pieces of ancient Rome or medieval times, and of course World War II, and it's just it's incredible how much history and legend and folklore is still really right there in front of you. And so my European experiences have been huge and have played a pretty big part in inspiring some of the material that we've written. We did one album called Gates of Fire that was basically a trilogy of concepts, and one concept was based off of Robert E. Howard stories, which Robert E. Howard was very influenced by Edgar Allan Poe, and I'm very influenced by Robert E. Howard too, so you know, the influence goes from generation to generation, you might say. And we also did a concept on the Gates of Fire, which was the Battle of Thermopylae, where King Leonidas and the 300 Spartans made their stand against the Persians and King Xerxes. And the other was a trilogy based on the fall of Ilium, or as most people know it, the fall of Troy, or the Trojan War. And so, you know, those were all concepts that I actually came up with while we were touring in Europe. I think we were in Greece when I came up with most of the ideas for that album. So our traveling is very inspirational to what we use in our material. Not only that, but just the fact that you know, you end up in this ancient type atmosphere in so many places all across Europe, and it inspires you to look into it more. I've always been a huge history buff and very much into mythology and folklore. At one point I was studying anthropology and archaeology at WSU, Wichita State University. You know, but you know, when I went to John Marshall, actually, in my writing and my English classes, and my reading classes, Edgar Allan Poe was one of several literary artists that were required reading for us. And with the likes of Sir Walter Scott or Shakespeare, of course. Uh, and I think it's just incredible that Poe was so influential on writing technique and composition, ways of using metaphors. Just, it's incredible what he did. And he came up with such an array of really strange stories. And I think one thing that has always amazed me is that unlike many other writers who venture off into different things, like Robert E. Howard actually wrote baseball stories, sports stories, westerns, things like that, and just other, types of stories than the genre that he's actually famous for. But Poe, on the other hand, everything he did, no matter if it was not necessarily a horror story, it had that eerie feel to it always. There was always that irony that Edgar Allan Poe put into his stories that made his stories seem strange and odd, or a little farther outside of the box than what was the norm back in those days. Actually, too much, maybe. Sometimes, well, here's a good example. I mentioned that we had done this trilogy concept of the fall of Ilium, or the Trojan War, and instead of basing it off of Homer's writings, which is what almost everybody refers to when they talk about the Trojan War, I actually based the material more off of Virgil's writings, which was a Roman poet that also wrote the same saga, or the first part of the Iliad that Homer wrote. And the stories are very similar. Most of the historical parts of it they all gel together and make the same sense. But with Virgil's version, it goes on to track this Trojan warrior king or leader by the name of Aeneas, and his escapades and his legacy of what he did with the remainder of the Trojan people in saving those tribes and actually going to what was known as Carthage and then across the Mediterranean to Italy, and actually being the founder, as far as the legend goes, of the Roman Empire, because it was his lineage that, actually were the people that built Rome and everything. So, I think it took me about a month to actually decipher all of the 12 books of Virgil about Aeneas and his escapades, and it's all called the Aeneid. And it was just extremely hard reading, because it's done in a style and a tongue and a fashion that is so unlike what we're used to reading ourselves nowadays. The composition was just extremely difficult, and of course it was poetic. And since it's put in poetry, sometimes there's lots of metaphorical use of words that we're not used to. Like I had to figure out what the main was. I didn't know what the main, the Spanish main. What the heck are you talking about? Well, it turns out that Virgil, his idea of the main would be the Mediterranean Sea. And so I actually had to do an awful lot of research just to understand what I was reading, and then, of course, just absorbing everything that I read. And I do the same thing when I'm creating Poe lyrics, and that's always been a huge challenge to me, to take something that is so classic in literary nature and then try and do it justice with our lyrics. It seems to be a pretty tall order most of the time, and so I read the stories over and over. Back in 1987, we put out an album called Mystification, and this was before CDs, basically, and so one whole side of the album was dedicated to Edgar Allan Poe's writings, and all the songs that we did on that side of the album were based off of his short stories or some of his poems. And even strangely enough, he's one of the few literary composers that we keep revisiting in albums after that too. We did a song called The Shadow that is based off of one of his short stories, and on our newest album that we're working in the studio on right now, we're doing a song called Into the Maelstrom, and it's based off of his short story Descent into the Maelstrom. So obviously, huge influence, and yeah, I dissect the works of the people that I'm trying to imitate. As far as when we work on lyrics, because I feel like it's really important to stay true to the nature of what they were trying to depict with their writings, and hopefully we, transfer some of that same depiction, through our music and through the songs that we write. That's actually an easy one for me. I mean, I love lots of Poe stories. I mean, most people would obviously come up with something like The Raven or The Pit and Pendulum or maybe Mask of the Red Death. All great stories. And Fall of the House of Usher. I know lots of people would love that. I do too. But my very favorite Poe story is the one called Mystification. And the reason it's so much of a favorite for me is because I actually believe, after reading that story hundreds of times, that Edgar Allan Poe was actually writing about his inner self in that story. I think he was really exposing his inner feelings about why he was a writer and why he was doing what he was with the genre that he was working in. So Mystification is definitely my favorite story, and it led on. It was a huge inspiration to people like H.P. Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard, because in this story, Mystification, he refers to a black book of necromancy type thing called the Book of Baron von Juntz. And later on, I seriously believe that H.P. Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard used that same idea of that book and turned it into what they considered the Necronomicon. And then they did a series of writings about the Necronomicon as well. And Howard even used it a little bit by referring to the books of Skelos and stuff. And it was really Edgar Allan Poe that started all of this stuff. I mean, we even see it in movies like Evil Dead. There's, the Book of the Dead, the Necronomicon. There's movies that have the Necronomicon in it. There's even people that actually believe that the Necronomicon was a real book written by the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred, when in actuality it was most likely, as far as we can tell, penned by Robert E. Howard and H.P. Lovecraft when they were sending pen pal letters back and forth with each other. And I think it was sort of a joke to them, but the thing is that this is all stuff, all of these different tentacles of what's happening about this book all started with just one guy, and that's Edgar Allan Poe, coming up with that initial idea. And so that story seems to have just branched out and been extremely important to more people than just myself. And so that, in a nutshell, even a long-winded one, is why Mystification is my favorite Poe story. Yeah, I got some comments for you guys. First of all, when I was your age, attending Marshall, really wasn't quite sure what I was going to do with my life yet, and was still just in awe of everything that I was absorbing as far as the world. I grew up in a time of conflict with Vietnam going on and everything. Marshall was actually the first, one of the very first schools to be integrated, as far as different races of people here in Wichita. And it was a tumultuous time for everybody. But amongst all of that chaos and that absorbing just the amazement of life in general, Marshall actually, and the teachers there and the staff actually, even though I didn't think it at the time, led me on to want to study and discover some of the things that have actually turned into a career for me. And although it's maybe not any direction that I would have really figured I would have gained any good inspiration or direction from my schooling at that time, it turns out that it was really vital. It was very important to what I'm achieving with my life nowadays. So I guess my last comment to you guys is hang in there. Don't give up. Give education a bit of a chance if you can, because it may not seem like fun, and it may seem more like a chore and something that you have to do. But in the long run, I finally got to the point where it became a lot of the things I studied became vitally important to the existence of myself in the world today. And not only that, but really important into being successful as a musician and helping create something that to me is cutting edge and evidently to a lot of others has been very influential to them, because we have dozens and dozens of bands all across Europe that do cover songs of our songs now, and there's even a double CD out there of 18 different bands all over the world playing Manila Road songs. And so, a lot of this is stuff I would have never achieved if I hadn't gone through a lot of the experiences I had while I was in school. And John Marshall was evidently a cool place to be because it led me on to do things like I've done today. So hang in there, don't give up, keep it heavy.